I'm going to start out summarizing the way the two political parties in our country have been polarized. And it's based on, they have two different goals. The one of them that calls themselves conservative are always trying to keep the government out of my life. Well, that's because John Locke had a philosophy of minimal government. So the government is military and police, and everybody should work hard, earn their money, right? Go get it worked in America. First, I mean, it worked. I mean, it got away with it in America because people didn't inherit land. Everybody could get their land, work hard. And then Locke did not want money. He wanted a barter system so you couldn't hoard things because he wanted a middle class. Okay, so what are his priorities? Minimal government, middle class, and science, enlightenment. Also, separation of church and state. You don't want any politician telling you he's speaking for God, or he's going to manipulate you and end up giving all the goodies to his friends and family and harming his enemies. All right. So he was Protestant, not traditional religion. He was the advisor to our founders. So the way he thinks is the way our founders think. Protestant rather than Catholic, a view of God that fit with Newtonian physics, not the traditional view. So these guys are religious heretics. Then you had separation of church and state. When you're acting as a civil magistrate or a citizen, you solve problems using reason, and you try to create a middle class, and you take care of your problems without the legal system getting in. You just have a town hall meeting, take care of your problems together, go home. You can go to church, but when you're at the town hall meeting, nobody gets to say, oh, that guy's Methodist, they're not going to pay attention to him, he's going to hell. None of that. All right. So separate your consciousness as a citizen from your religious consciousness, which fine, you have freedom of religion, just don't bring it into politics. All right, the next thing was science. Very important. We're creating a science of government. So political science, social science, really big. Middle class, okay, and minimal government. Minimal government, social political science, middle class, separate church and state, different view of God. All right, keep that in mind. The other side is that our Constitution says the Congress is responsible for four things, but the one that's controversial is public well-being. I think it says common welfare. All right. So the Democrats say you can have any religion you want. You can even have no religion. Over here, you had to have some religion. All right. Just separate church and state. Okay. These guys are trying to bring it back. That's not our founders. What they emphasize is a middle class. If you want a middle class, if you want the common welfare, healthcare is not what it used to be. It's something entirely different, and it costs a lot of money, and we have to have government involvement, or only 5% of the people are going to get any, right? So they're arguing for taxes. Everybody pays taxes, especially the rich. They want to tax the rich to create a middle class. Aristotle advocated a big inheritance tax so you wouldn't have a wealthy, elite, rich class. Okay, so healthcare is going to have taxes and public healthcare. In order to have a middle class job today, you need a lot of education, high quality K through 12, college, grad school. Nobody can afford it unless you have public education paid for by collective taxing based on income, right? Or nowadays based on wealth. So if you have investments in the stock market and those investments make money, you should be taxed on that because that's wealth. Okay. Let me go. So you get the general idea. The Democrats, middle class, whatever it takes. Government intervention if necessary. Green economy, right? The natural world's going to collapse, but our economy is going to collapse. It's on a suicidal course right now. We've got to move to a green economy. We have to have laws that punish people for creating carbon and that reward people for going green. Get the government out of my life, right? Okay, so let's go with this list. It's interesting. It's partly depressing because it's so cut and dried and it's so polarized and it's so based. Wow, we got all three of our students here. Okay, I'm sorry about your son. And let me just say that I know everybody in this class is making an effort to make it to class. Ivy has made these heroic efforts, Alicia, and I really appreciate it. I think everybody appreciates it because if Dr. Beck will just shut her mouth, they have a lot of nice things to say. Okay, so abortion, right to life versus right to control your body, right? It's always this rights language has nothing to do with the women wrestling with it. It's all this cut and dried abstract stuff. All right, gun control. This is not, our founders did not mean that anybody can buy an AK-47 or that, guns were a personal thing. It was about protecting yourself from the federal government militia. All right, so laws about felons shouldn't get guns, mentally ill people shouldn't. I mean, our founders, I think they would say that's common sense, but some of them keep the government out of, maybe, but that isn't what that Second Amendment means, FYI, okay? Poverty programs, right? If you don't have poverty programs, you have debtor prison. You just put people in prison for not being able to pay their bills, okay? Because the way the economy works, people need education, healthcare, housing. They can't just make it on their own. They have to get some loans, government loans, to get the tools they need so they can get the jobs to be in a middle class. Things have changed, right? To get a job, you need a computer, for example. You probably need a car, right? And so it's just, everything is different from what it was if you want a middle class. But if you just want minimal government, okay, you're going to get people in prison, and that costs the government a lot of money. But John Locke says, no, that's what government's for. Military, police, jails, prisons. That's it. All right, that's what you're going to get. Gay rights, the science, right? Our founders would follow the science and promote a middle class. Don't discriminate or they can't get into the middle class. Disability. All right, that John Locke types minimal government. No, the Democrats, get them into the middle class. Don't let them fall. We don't want them in the street, right? We want people to be able to eat and have houses. Social Security, right? The alternative is orphanages and poorhouses, because that was called socialism, raving socialism. But it works. If we didn't have it, imagine if people were supposed to just save their own money for retirement. What do people do when they have money? Obviously, everybody's in debt. So Americans would not save, and they would end up in a poorhouse. Or if they have kids that become drug addicts, their grandkids would end up in an orphanage. Now, because they're on Social Security, they can raise their grandkids. Bankruptcy law, right? Ways to, when you go bankrupt, why do people go bankrupt? One major issue is healthcare, which is different from what it used to be. Get that government out of my life, right? Okay. Affirmative action, our founders had slaves, right? Women couldn't vote. Now, how are you going to account for this? How are you going to get everybody into the middle class? Sex ed, get that government out. Well, it works. It prevents unwanted pregnancies. The death penalty. Okay, the Democrats are against it. It costs over twice as much money. It doesn't deter. So they do it all on the basis of statistics. It's not a deterrent. It doesn't, it has no positive effects. Costs twice as much money, makes a bunch of lawyers rich. That's it. The Republicans, people are wicked. They commit a crime, they get the punishment, right? Environmental law, oh my God, no. Hey, we don't live in rural America with the 40 acres and a mule. We have this huge international fossil fuel economy that's destroying the earth. We have to change. Mandated education, healthcare, regulations on corporations, regulations on banking. That's why we had the collapse. The banking industry was not regulated. Regulations on government agencies. The government agencies are there to enforce the laws. If you have laws, but no one's going to enforce it, you might as well not make the law. So we have these agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency. What about our tax policy? Should it be regressive, where if you're poor, you pay the same percentage of tax? Or should you the rich should pay more? Right now, our tax system is regressive. The richer you are, the less you pay. The poorer you are, the more you pay. Dry counties, the Democrats will say, people just drive outside of the county, get drunk, drive home, have a crash. There's no statistical evidence that it's beneficial to the society. The other side, people are evil. We gotta force them to be good. Stem cell research. Look, you don't like the products, don't use them. You're free not to use any therapies that include stem cell. Okay. If George H.W. Bush has Parkinson's, but it was stem cell research that would give him the drugs, just refuse to get it, right? If you're against it, just refuse the drugs and let him get Parkinson's. No problem. What about Mr. Trump when he got COVID? One of the drugs that he had, stem cell research. He didn't turn them down. But, the Democrats will say, you don't have to take these therapies. You're free to act on your religious beliefs. Fine. Just don't force it. Okay. All right. So that's any questions or comments on that? Does everybody understand the pattern?
Yeah.
Okay. Ivy, you understand the pattern? What about you, Alicia? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. The pattern just seems to repeat itself, and we're always stuck on one extreme or the other. And these people who are so worried about government interference, I don't think it's really, they're worried about any interference. They don't want to be told how to live any part of their lives. And I think it's selfish. I don't think they have any idea what it costs other people.
Well,
So,
it ends up being more expensive because you end up with
Yeah.
all these people in prison, in jail, unable to get jobs, I mean, and also the fossil fuel costs. I
yeah.
mean, it's even costing insurance companies. They're bankrupting insurance companies. They can't pay all. I mean, it doesn't save money at all,
Mhm.
but that's what the Democrats worry about. But it doesn't have minimal government. It just has a lot of government intervention for police, jails, prisons, court system. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that word I think is the difference. Intervention versus interference.
Okay.
And you've got one set of people on the one hand that thinks everything is interfering. They're not worried about the needs of other people. They're only looking at their small corner of the world,
And public policy is the study of how to what did you say? Not
intervene.
intervene in a way always to have a middle class. That's
Mhm.
always their goal.
Yeah.
Because they say you can have any religious belief you want, but as a citizen and as a representative of the government, it's our responsibility to constantly try to create a middle class. Does that make sense, Alicia?
Yeah.
But that is no longer even discussed.
No.
Yeah, that big problem. If every focus group, the question was, do you think the death penalty will help improve the middle class? Will lead to a stronger, if you just keep asking, it might occur to people that might be a value they should think about. But it's amazing how propagandized everything is. Does that make sense, Alicia?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to egoist theories or egoist applications of other people's theories.
Well, it's original sin underneath that when people go to church every week and everybody's, So, the philosophers are kind of milquetoast when they just go with egoist. Because in most people's minds, it's,
Yeah, I'm just, even though, okay, if you don't phrase the question, what do you think about the death penalty in terms of how it affects or helps establish a middle class?
right.
Okay, if you leave that last part off, just what do you think about the death penalty? We're not thinking about anything except whatever our own moral law is and whatever is best for us. And
Or
that's
what you
kind of what I
believe
meant
in.
by, yeah.
I mean, it's a set of beliefs that our founders said you can have all these beliefs, but over here as a citizen, consciousness of a citizen, you have to worry about how much it costs the government, whether it actually has any positive consequences. Is there any evidence that it deters people?
Right, which is kind of, I hope I don't get this wrong, rule of law. If you're going to live in America, then you're agreeing to live by the guidelines that have been set for Americans and American government and American citizens and all that, whether it kind of goes against what you would do just for yourself.
Right, that's the
Yeah.
tacit consent. That's John Locke.
Okay.
It's just that the laws, this is where we get to Marx. He says the whole legal system is made by the rich for the rich.
Mhm.
So then what do you do, right? Okay, we're going to move right in there in just a sec. But Warren, what do you think? Does this make sense to you?
Ultimately, it makes sense. Yes, it does. Not all of it makes sense, but I think to tie everything that I would have said in one phrase, Alicia just did it, where she said, if you plan on living in the United States, all the laws that are here, that are in place, even though you might not know about all of them, like every single law that there is, you must know something that's going on here and you still choose to come here. So it is not that you're accepting the law, because there's a difference between acceptance and tolerance. So I think most people might tolerate it when they come here, because I'm a person, I'm not from here. Most of the laws that are here are totally different from what's in my country back in Jamaica. But coming here, I had some idea what the country was about. And it's not that I accept the laws that are here, but I tolerate them for the greater good, because not all of them directly affect me as a person. And that's being selfish in a sense, but I mean, you have to be selfish at some point. But it's not a case where I'm accepting the law, or it's not a case where I am the one who made the law, so the law is about me or I accept it. It's already there. It's coming from way before us. And though some of the times the laws that were made back then are still in place now, but things back then were different from how they are now, but they still are. But I mean, as I said, it's what you choose to tolerate.
Well, also, so Warren, remember Socrates accepted the system, the legal system of a jury, trial by jury, the rule of law, even though the citizens just voting against him were corrupt in their application of it. So, for example, Warren, I mean, you could have an experience where you apply for a job
Mm-hmm.
and you don't get it, and you can figure out you were the most qualified. But in Arkansas, the right to work means that you have a right, the employer has a right not to tell you why they didn't hire you, why they fired you. So what are you going to do? In other words, that's a case where we have a law, but then we have another law that says you can't enforce that law. So why would you have, I mean, no, that's where our legal system gets really screwed up, right?
Yeah, the law if you can't enforce it.
Yeah, or even this law says, well, yeah, you don't have to enforce it. You don't have to tell anybody why you hired them or why you fired them. And so you're not accountable to the law, which is crazy, right? That there's a lot of states that are passing laws that I think if you took it to the Supreme Court, they would say that this is illegal, right?
Yeah.
But you have to have somebody with money to take it that far. You have to take it to a federal court, whatever. That's getting to be a huge problem right now. But anyway, the other thing was Martin Luther King, you know, he demonstrated against Jim Crow laws, but he demonstrated non-violently, right? So there are some just plain old bad laws, like women getting the vote. They had to, you know, they had to demonstrate and they got arrested. But sometimes it's the law itself that's bad. Sometimes it's the people applying the law.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's the environmental laws are good, but if the president puts a person in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency that says, quote, we're not going to interfere in the economic system. So it becomes an environmental destruction agency. Because the only time an issue comes up before the EPA is when somebody makes money by destroying the environment. Otherwise, it would never get taken to the EPA. So when the guy that runs it says, we're going to run it for business sake, what he's saying is, I'm not going to apply any of these laws for 4 years. Okay. Okay, well, that's what I vote on the basis of. Who is the president going to appoint to the cabinet to enforce our laws? But that's a segue into the argument today, right? Karl Marx. So in Europe, what happened was everybody thought, those Enlightenment thinkers, right? We're going to have this wonderful middle class. We're going to have political science and social science, and oh, it's going to be so great. We're going to separate church and state. It's just going to be wonderful. And you know what? It wasn't. So what happened? Right? The owners, the industrialists, developed this social Darwinist theory. Winner takes all, right? If you're skilled and you develop this new industry and you have these talents and you have this ability, you deserve to succeed. And if somebody gets left in the gutter, that's because they're stupid or lazy, and we ought to let them die, right? Social Darwinism is if you aren't fit, if you can't adapt, you die, right? That's what happens with species as the biosphere gets more sophisticated. Some species emerge, like some new industry, and some species die off, right? And that was
Survival of the fittest.
yes, exactly. So that's what was happening. Well, do you think the workers at the bottom thought this was okay?
Definitely not.
Okay, so what happened? There were big revolutions. And what I want to point out, this is Aristotle, okay? He said the cause of the revolution is just the gap between the rich and the poor. That's all it is. It's not because of some big historical change. But Karl Marx was a child of his time. And so he adopted scientism. He adopted the view of progress. He adopted the blank slate. He adopted the view that we were moving history forward and we were actually carving out space that never existed before. So that would be the part of Marx that has been discredited. But what I want to point out is that everybody in his time thought that way. It's not just Marx's problem. Do you understand that? Like our founders and the French, they thought that we would never have authoritarianism again because we're enlightened and the psyche is blank and nature is blank. And we're going to be able to develop this, and we're not going to ever become primitive like they were in the past. So now I want you to raise your hand, or Ivy can do a thumbs up. I'm going to ask you some questions. How many of you think that the way you think, the way you live, the choices you make are related to your place in the economic system? So rich people think one way, middle class people think, or if your parents are educators, you think one way. If your parents are welders, you think one way. If your parents, I mean, wherever you are in the economic system controls your consciousness. You don't think that? It influences it. Okay.
I believe so too. I believe it influences it
Okay.
at the age.
How many of you think that Americans in general are greedy? They think money will make you happy. Ivy says yes. Okay, Warren.
Yes.
Americans in general, how many of you think that people value other people according to how much money they make?
Not everyone, but that happens.
Okay. Now, the thing about that is that if you did respect people based on how much money they make, you would have no respect for your college professors. Because except for the humanities ones, they don't count. But the business ones, the science ones, the math ones, they could make a lot more money in corporations. And so if you value people based on how much money they make, and if everybody is supposed to be motivated by money, you would never have a good teacher. Does that make sense? Teachers are constitutionally underpaid because nobody should go into teaching just because it makes the most money, because they can't make money doing anything else. Does that make sense? You would get really bad teachers, right? They wouldn't have the patience. They wouldn't have a sense of calling. Does that make sense to all of you?
Yes.
Okay. So there, you know, we wouldn't have any artists. We wouldn't, you know, there's a lot of stuff we wouldn't have if everybody is just groveling to get that higher paying job. You have to think about what the society would be like if that's all people valued. And, you know, people will without any guilt say greed is good. It motivates culture, but they have no idea. Like, would you just think this through? It would mean everybody is dog eat dog. The job you get, somebody's going to try to undercut you. Somebody's going to compete with you, even if you are the better worker. No, you shouldn't ever listen to somebody else. Don't be fair to opposing points of view. Don't be patient. Just everything is money, whatever it takes. You would get these competitive, adversarial, survival of the fittest. You would have this huge animosity between people. You would have this huge gap between the rich and the poor. And the society would just commit suicide, right? You would never be able to cultivate a decent level of social interaction. Does that make sense to you? That is what happened, right? In Europe. The poor were coming in off the farms, off the fiefdoms. They were coming into the city to get work in the factories or in the coal mines, right? They would, you know, they would have to work 17 hours a day, 6 days a week. And then on the one day off, they'd go drink, get drunk. And then the owners would say, you see, these people are barbarians, like they're uncivilized. Do you remember when John Stuart Mill, his dad, raised him to condition him because he wanted to prove to those conservatives that an IQ and being cultivated is a function of your conditioning. It's not a function of what you're born with. Okay, and do you understand that his dad was doing this right at a time when what they were looking at with their eyeballs was a lot of people working in coal mines, people working in factories that just looked like they were stupid, right? And didn't take care of their health and didn't care about their kids, right? There were no child labor laws. There were no laws, right? And so they started having these movements. The first one was to give workers a chance to unionize so they could collectively strike and force the owner to get better conditions. Then the next thing, and Adam Smith worried about this, was that the owners couldn't get together and decide what the minimum wage was. You know, you pay the workers just enough to survive. But if one of those owners, you know, offered the workers something better, then every worker would go over there, right? And then they could have some leverage and they could say, I'm not coming back to your place because I have a better deal here. Then it would get competitive. And so the first set of laws, the first big fights were about unionizing and making it illegal for owners to meet secretly. And so let me just talk about Marx's theory, because this is the theory behind all those revolutions. And I know we're going to have to take next time at least part of next time. But I want to be able to talk to you enough so you get a good idea of what Karl Marx was up to. But I think that you don't just get the theoretical idea, you get what were they looking at with their eyeballs, you know, what was going on. And so first of all, Marx said, look, you guys, Locke, Locke and Mill, you say you're basing things on science. It's bullshit. You know, that's not science. First of all,
people.
what?
He disagrees with a lot of people.
Well, look at it. I mean, John Locke's view of rights, everybody's born free and equal, that's garbage, right? People are born into an economic system and they're born very dependent on each other and they get formed by that, right? That's a reasonable criticism, right, Warren?
Yes, yes. I'm not saying he's wrong for disagreeing. I'm just saying he disagrees with a lot of people.
Right. Well, then John Stuart Mill's higher pleasures, everybody would agree. I was like, that's bullshit. You know, people's pleasures are a function of what they do at work, how much time they get off, right? And John Stuart Mill is sitting there, you know, if we just socially construct something, and Karl Marx says, as long as capitalists are in charge, you are never going to socially construct anything that gives everyone leisure time. There's no way, because capitalism is based on greed and it's not going to stop. They're not going to choose not to be greedy, right? Okay, so he says this is based on science. This is the god-awful truth. The real people. People become who they are by doing what they do to survive. The nature of individuals, the way people are molded, depends upon the material conditions determining their production. So during the feudal era, people thought they were molded one way. Now during the industrial era, they're molded another way. And if we overthrow the capitalists and have communists, they're going to be molded another way. That's his big thing. Consciousness, the way you think, feel, your identity, is determined by your life, what you do to survive. We're born blank. Genetics doesn't play a big role. The environment plays the big role, and not any aspect of the environment, but the economic system. He disagreed with Locke, he disagreed with Mill, he disagreed with Hobbes. People aren't by nature selfish. This would be Augustine, original sin. People aren't by nature sinners. The economic system drives them into being greedy or lust, greed, lust, pride, envy, gluttony, sloth. So if working class people seem to be lazy, it's because they're being exploited, right? They're not going to do more than they have to for that SOB at the top who's exploiting them. Let's see. Condorcet thought human beings were perfectible within the economic system. Rousseau, the noble savage. Yeah, okay. Economic determinism. Relations between nations depend on each nation's economic development. Relations within a nation depends on the nation's economic development. The nature of the economy determines the division of labor. The division of labor implies that each person has one identity as a human being and another identity at work, whatever they're labeled as according to the economic system. Okay, so what Marx wants is he wants a society where people take turns getting different jobs. So their identity is not stuck in what they do to survive. So the culture is based on common humanity. So Alicia, you better watch out. You're almost a socialist, you know, you said that. Whenever a person's human beings' social identity is separated from their personal identity. There's alienated labor. Okay, so, and I'll talk about alienated labor in a sec. Adam Smith said that the division of labor was wonderful. It was what was going to drive progress forward because, he said, for example, if you make those nails that go into horseshoes that you nail into the horse's foot, if one person at a forge makes it, they make 17 a day. But if you have this mass production line and everybody has a very, very specialized job, you can make 1,700 a day. So this was the, all in for the Ford plant and, that whole industrial era where you have these huge factories and everybody just does this one tiny little thing. Everybody's an extension of a machine, but you get all this stuff at the other end, right? So people become commodities. People are just extensions of a machine. Alienated labor. In an economic system where people are oppressed, those on the bottom are alienated from their labor. So you pour your humanity. They don't care about what they're making. They're pouring their humanity into making it so that the factory owner is getting the profits, and it's exploitative, right? I mean, even in right outside of Batesville, there's Harps is a people-owned company. It's owned by the people who engage, right? That's socialism, actually. So there's nobody owning it who's making a ton of money off of it. They share the profits within them. I'm not quite sure how Harps works, but I mean, that's the way they advertise themselves is actually god awful socialism, but they'll never say that. Workers are alienated from themselves. They spend their lives doing something they don't identify with. They're stuck with this social identity, which is controlled by the rich. They have to hide who they really are while they're forced to work at things they don't care about. They're alienated from other workers because they're forced to compete with each other in order to survive. They're pitted against each other and made to work as hard as possible in order for the owner to profit as much as possible. They're alienated from nature because capitalism requires exploiting natural resources. Capitalism is always exploitative because the workers never get paid for the value of what they produce. The owner always he only gives part of the profits, he keeps the rest for himself, supposedly to start new ventures, right? But I mean, he just pockets the change also to make his mansions, to buy his mansions and all his other luxury goods. If it was just to create more factories to advance, that would be one thing. But of course, that's not what's happening. It's the reason why the owners say, I've got to have a profit. Okay, so Locke's view is one where free and equal people engage in this signing of contracts, but that's not what, Locke didn't want money. So the way it works is the owners said, this is a free country, you're free and equal, you're a free agent, here's your contract, you work 16 hours a day in the coal mine 6 days a week, you're free to sign the contract or not, this is not an authoritarian system, this is freedom, right? Is that really freedom? Does the worker really want to sign on to that? But he has no choice, right? There's no better deal because employers have all figured out everybody's going to offer the same deal. So the employers can really, really screw the workers and the ultimate. And so Marx is saying it will absolutely get the ultimate out of those workers just so they don't die, right? whatever. So the workers are just an extension of the machine, a commodity, just a tool for the owners to make money. And so he gives this historical past of the way economic systems determined everything. And in the past, because the arrangements were exploitative, they ended up destroying themselves. They were, I'll just whip through this for a second. The feudal era, they started depending upon the shop owners. The shop owners started making plows. Then they started making, as industry improved, more and more goods. At a certain point, the shopkeepers had more economic clout than the fief owners, and then they were overthrown. That was what he said, is all these revolutions were basically about economic changes because of science and industry. That was what was going on under the surface. Now, capitalism has created a world in its own image, and it has to constantly change. It changes the entire world from rural to urban. So I want you to eyeball this, read over, because it's very compelling. So I teach in Southeast Asia, and they're being exploited, right? It's by capitalism. And so you can make an argument that capitalism is right now destroying itself because it's based on fossil fuels and all that. But for Marx, he thought the solution, this is where the problem was, his idea of the solution, that the proletariat would take over. And he had this idea, in a factory economy, people would only need to work 30 hours a week. They wouldn't need to be highly trained. There weren't going to be highly skilled jobs. Of course, what's happened is we've moved into a tech information age. So we have a different economy that Marx could not have anticipated. So we do need specialization. And so that's what Gorbachev, when Russia switched over, Gorbachev he accepted all the criticisms of capitalism, but he said, we still have to move into a post-industrial era, a high-tech era, and we've got to make the adjustments. So where I want to go with this is, well, I do want to go through all of this because it's all really interesting. But at this moment in time, you could argue that we are going to have to make this transition into a information high-tech economy. And people are thinking about things like there aren't going to be enough jobs, like robots do everything. And how are we going to adapt? So some people are saying everybody should have a guaranteed income. That's it. Just give people money, because otherwise they're going to starve in the street. So that would be one, it's just the reality of what happens. There's going to be very few people at the top that are all those computer nerds, and they're going to be controlling everything. What kind of jobs are we going to get, right? All these jobs people used to have are run by machines. Now, is that compelling? To what extent is it true? And then we have to move from a fossil fuel economy to a green economy. So what is that going to do? At this particular moment, we can create a whole lot of jobs putting solar panels on our houses, because you can't offshore that. Those would be jobs right here in the US. So there would be definitely US jobs, local jobs that people can get to make that transition to the green economy. But anyway, people are talking a lot about how economic changes will change the culture. And it's not Karl Marx's solution. It's not eliminating private property, but it's Karl Marx's kind of economic analysis. And Aristotle actually analyzed most of human history is just the rich versus the poor. So Marx has, he knew, he read this stuff. He just also had this Enlightenment thing that if we just get rid of private property, everything will work out. And that was utopian, but you know, Mill was utopian. Locke, I mean, it's not like he wasn't the only one that was utopian. So you got to cut him some slack there. But I do think with Alicia, you know, when you're saying there's a difference between intervention and interference, what you would argue is in an information age, in a high tech age, we need interventions, right, in order to save the middle class. And that would be a Marxist economic analysis, but not a Marxist conclusion, right? We're not going to get rid of the private sector, but we definitely have to have different laws to regulate the business community, to reward green, to punish carbon, to reward, you know, we've got to have a different set of reward and punishment systems for businesses so that the business sector will change to adapt to the information age. Does that make sense to you guys? I do think it's all really interesting. I guess I'm a nerd, but you know, if you can understand how much of what you experience is really, you know, philosophy is the backstory. If you can understand that, because nobody would think philosophy explains their life, you know, it's just not the way we think about philosophy. But it actually does, if you can figure it out. All right, so I know Warren has to go, and thanks. And I talked a lot, but next time we're going to start with your reactions, right? And start out with what you did like about Marx and what you didn't like and what's applicable today, okay? And remind me that I told you I would start out with you, okay? All right. Bye-bye.